Hello, everyone. Welcome aboard our World Wings Flight #1 edition of Jet Reads, where Pan Am really makes the reading great. I'm Nancy McAllister, president of World Wings, and on behalf of our international board, I'd love to welcome you on this flight, and we're so glad you're here. Now's the time to sit back, buckle up, and relax. Prepare for takeoff as we embark to exciting destinations between the covers of books. Your skipper today is Becky Sprecher. She's a member of the Atlanta chapter, and many of you remember her from the Savannah Convention where she kept you spellbound. You also know her as the author of the lead articles that we do in Jet Wings, and she's also the curator, along with Diane Groh, of our new feature, Galley Talk. In-flight entertainment today will be the live interviews with Charlie Imbriani, Julia Cook, and Ed Trippe. Technical requirements for this flight are made possible by our talented World Wings communications and webmaster, Linda Reynolds. This flight is a benefit of your membership in World Wings. As we taxi here, I'd like to point out that questions directed to Julia, Charlie, and Ed may be submitted via Zoom's chat feature. Our recording secretary, Susan Dines, is gathering the questions together for post-flight submission to the authors. Upon their return, we will distribute them to everyone. Have a black box. So we are recording this for the future and for all those who were unable to make it today. Again, that has to have a little wizardry performed by Linda afterwards, and she'll do that and we'll send that link out too. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Skipper Becky and our guests to present Jet Reads, Pan Am Makes the Reading Great. Becky?
Thank you, Nancy. Hi, everybody. I'm Becky Sprecher, and welcome to our very first Jet Reads. We've chosen 3 books to spotlight today, as Nancy mentioned. The first one is Pan American Airways, Missions of Mercy and Evacuation Flights by Charlie Imbriani, Come Fly the World by Julia Cook, and Pan Am's First Lady, The Diary of Betty Stettinius Trippe. Ed Trippe, who is Betty's youngest child and president of the Pan Am Historical Foundation, will be here to discuss that with us. Each of these books illuminates our corporate culture as well as the character of our employees. We're going to talk to everybody in just a second, but I just wanted to say hello to my co-host, World Wings board member and communications coordinator, Linda Reynolds. Hi, Linda. She's probably busy letting everyone in. You there, Linda? There she is. Okay, our first book, Pan American Airways, Missions of Mercy and Evacuation Flights. It's by Charlie Imbriani. And Charlie started his Pan Am career in 1964 at JFK, working in ramp operations, passenger service, and the Clipper Club. He went with Delta in 1991 and spent the next 10 years as station manager in St. Petersburg, Russia. He finished up his career as a station manager in Gainesville, Florida, and in Tallahassee. He retired in 2001 and earned a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies from Florida State University. Hi, Charlie. Okay, we need to get you off mute there. Okay. Charlie, can you unmute yourself?
Hello, everybody.
There you go. Welcome, welcome. Welcome to the craziness of the Zoom world. It's a whole new era, but there are train wrecks all the time, and we'll get through it, and somehow with getting people on and off mute and stuff. Tell us what inspired you to write this book.
Well, first, I'd like to thank World Wings International for this opportunity to promote my book. I really appreciate that. Well, I spent 27 years with Pan Am. Most of that time was at JFK. So I was kind of a secondhand witness to the events that I describe in my book. An organization's history is its legacy, and Pan Am has an incredible legacy, and it was about to be forgotten. So I felt an urge to document these works. But as time went by, passed, finally, when Pan Am went out of business, then that urge became very pressing. But I still put it off until I was retired. But we finally got it down, and we documented this history.
Well, I think after you hear some of this, you all are going to agree that these volunteers were real heroes, and we're going to tell some of their stories. What were the qualifiers for a particular flight or a series of flights to be included in this book as a mission of mercy and or an evacuation flight?
Yeah, well, how I chose the operations or flights to qualify as a mission of mercy, I set down 4 qualifiers or criteria. And these, I didn't make them up. They kept popping up at me as I was doing my research. The first was that the existence of an humanitarian crisis somewhere in the world. That would be a life and death situation. The second criteria was the existence of danger for those who intervene, and that would be, in this case, the Pan Am crews who had to go in or the ground staff. The third criteria was the voluntary nature of the operation. They were all volunteers. No one was ever forced to do it. Those who participated were volunteers. Lastly, it was not for profit. Pan Am didn't do any of these evacuations or mercy flights for profit. And the reader will see that for the most part, Pan Am lost money in these operations. They're the 4 criteria I used.
Right. And most of them were at the request of the State Department, but some were initiated by Pan Am employees. Is that right?
Yes. Some of them came down from the top down. I describe it. So it came from, say, the State Department through corporate headquarters. But there were a lot of on-the-spot situations where Pan Am frontliners made a decision that, we're going to go in and perhaps divert a flight or something of that nature.
Right. Why was Pan Am uniquely qualified for these missions?
Well, there's 2 reasons: expediency and experience. Experience, of course, Pan Am was forged in the crucible of World War II, and especially in evacuations. Pan Am did a lot of evacuations in World War II, so we had proven ourselves to the government. The other one, expediency, has a lot to do with positioning. Pan Am, as we all know here on this Zoom, was ubiquitous around the world. We were just about everywhere. So it was convenient for the U.S. government to call on us.
Okay. What were the different categories of missions?
What I have as categories are, in the early days, at-sea rescues, right? These days of the flying boats gave us the opportunity, and a lot of times to land, even in rough seas, to effect at-sea rescues. Another one in the early days was providing communications. A lot of the stations we flew to in the early days had no communications with the outside world. So a lot of, especially in Central and South America, and we set up communication stations in a lot of these places. And also our planes, the cockpits, became a link in a chain of communication to the outside world. And that was important in natural disasters for us.
And then,
another category is disaster relief. We flew in at a time there was a natural disaster, food, medical supplies. We brought in aid workers during these. However, The largest category are evacuations, and that's what pretty much defines the book, these major evacuations.
Right.
We would evacuate people during wars or political upheavals, revolutions, coups d'etats, and all those reasons. Yes.
Yeah. You make the point throughout the book that the culture of Pan Am was one with a sense of humanity. So I'd like to start with a small mission that's an example of that. And it's the 1970 rescue of an 11-year-old boy named Pascal Lemaire down on Noumea. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I selected this story. There are several of them to demonstrate that Pan Am would actually go out of its way and lose money to save the life of one person. You know, in 1970, the Pierre Lemaire, the 11-year-old boy, had an accident, and he sustained a serious head injury, and he needed surgery immediately, but there wasn't available in Noumea at the time. They didn't have the operating facility, so a call for help went out, and the Pan Am manager, Bill Crothers in Australia, picked up the message, contacted Pan Am headquarters. In 30 minutes, they got back to him, and they said, we're going to take flight 811 from Honolulu to Sydney and divert it. The flight was already en route, so they announced it to the passengers, and they praised Pan Am for doing this to save a young man's life. The flight landed. They picked up the young man, his father, and a nursing nun who was attending him. By the time they arrived in Sydney, the flight was only 30 minutes behind schedule. Pan Am staff met them, took him to the hospital. He had the surgery, one diversion, one life saved. But it's the postscript to that story was a letter by the young man's mother to Pan Am. It's a real short letter. I'd like to read it because it really captures the essence of that nature of Pan Am and its people, that humanitarian outreach. Let me quote this. His mother writes, I have just returned from vacation in New Zealand and learned the details of the diversion of the Pan Am flight and the quick boarding of my son for Sydney. I would never know to thank Pan Am enough. Your diligence and your wonderful sense of humanity. Because of you, my little boy's life was saved. You know how a mother must feel for all those who contributed to this great miracle. Once again, 1,000 thanks, Mrs. Suzanne Lemaire.
Wonderful, wonderful story. A second example is Typhoon Rita. What happened? Briefly tell us what happened and how was whirlwinger Amy Okamoto of the Honolulu chapter involved?
Yes. Well, there's several of these rescues we went in that we supported for natural disasters, but this one is a good one to pick because we have a Pan Am flight attendants are prominent in this. In December 1972, a super typhoon hit Manila and caused a lot of death and destruction. And Amy Okamoto was flying in on Pan Am's flight 841 from Honolulu to Manila, and she couldn't tell, looking out the window, where the water started, where the water ended, and where the land started. Everything was flooded, and she made up her mind that when she got back to Honolulu, she would do something about it. On her return, she contacted the organization Volunteers in Action, which is a group of Pan Am flight attendants, Honolulu-based, who dedicated themselves to coming to the aid and serving and helping people who face natural disasters or other calamities in the areas that Pan Am serves. So she got the Volunteers of America. They went out, they solicited donations, solicited medical supplies. But the important thing was it was an example to other Pan Am employees. And in this particular disaster, Pan Am donated containers and put them there, and the Pan Am people got out collectively, especially in Honolulu and especially in San Francisco. And all of that aid was flown in on Pan Am free of charge. So that just shows you how Pan Am employees can work within the framework of Pan Am and without it.
Wonderful, wonderful. You've included in the book chapters on the Vietnam R&R flights and evacuation flights, which we're going to talk to Julia about in just a minute. You've also included the Berlin airlift and various activities in Cuba. But since we don't have an unlimited amount of time, I'd like to get into some detail on the Iranian operation. You point out that this was a lengthy evacuation that went on in stages over a period of months in late 1978 and early 1979 as the situation in the country deteriorated. Tell us what those stages, those 3 stages were.
All right. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that it was the largest, the longest, and the most dangerous of all evacuations for Pan Am. And it lasted over 6 months. And we carried, well, there were roughly at that time about 41,000 Americans in Iran at the time. And that was mostly workers and their dependents. Now, there were 3 stages. What I did is I broke the evacuation down into 3 stages. The first stage was sustained by Pan Am's scheduled flights. There was no order to evacuate, but most corporations and the American government was suggesting that the dependents get out of the country. So most of them were carried out on the scheduled flights. The second stage were charter flights by American corporations. For example, one was Bell Helicopter that had 4,000 employees there, and some of the other corporations. But it was the third stage, which was the official evacuation, and that was declared by President Jimmy Carter at the time. Right. Now, in anticipation,
that occurred in late January, right? And went through till the end of February.
Yeah, the whole 6 months was from September 1968 through February of 1979.
Right. Let's pick up the story just before stage 3 begins in late January, when Ayatollah Khomeini is about to return to Iran after living in exile in France. You write that there was rioting in the streets and shooting around the Pan Am office in town. The nearby El Al office was on fire, and the banks on Pahlavi Avenue were being attacked. Now, the ramp at the airport is still in operation, but a command post has been set up in town at the Hyatt Hotel. Who was in each of these locations and what were they doing?
All right, Pan Am set up this command post at the Hyatt in anticipation of the official evacuation. Now, it was made up of several people. Lou Malone, who was the station manager in Tehran, Rick Rendam, who was a cargo manager, and Don Sims, who was the country manager for Turkey. Captain John Powers was part of it. He was Pan Am's chief pilot. He was there on business, and with Captain Jim Nelson. Right? There was another person, of course, who was at the command post daily. That was Joe Reynolds. Joe was the ramp operations manager, and it was his duty or his responsibility to give a report on the situation at the airport on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I want to remind our viewers that Joe is the late husband of our Whirlwind member, Linda. So we're going to call on her in just a second to answer a question. You write that the Ayatollah wanted to arrive in Tehran on a Pan Am charter aircraft. I did not know that.
Yes.
Tell us.
All right, I found that in the Pan Am archives, that story. It seems that the Ayatollah's team contacted Pan Am, wanted to charter a flight. He was in Paris at that time. And by coincidence, Bill Sewell, who was Pan Am's CEO at the time, was at the White House for a dinner. And the national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, approached Sewell and said to him, "You're not going to do that charter, are you?" And Bill Sewell got the hint, and they denied it. So Air France got the honor to carry in the Ayatollah back.
You're not going to do that charter, are you? So I mean, I'm not making light of a very serious situation here, though, but that did strike me as kind of funny.
Yeah.
So Khomeini arrives on Air France on February 1st, and there are over 3 million people in the streets, and he immediately urges the expulsion of foreigners, all foreigners. And Prime Minister Shapur Bakhtiar resigns. On February 8th, Pan Am positions volunteer crews in Istanbul for evacuation flights as they wait for permission to enter Iranian airspace. There are still 7,000 Americans waiting to get out. And then a few days later, on February 12th, at 2 o'clock in the morning, demonstrators stormed the Gaza prison, which was located right behind the Hyatt, and all hell breaks loose. Tell us what happened.
Yes, okay. Well, it's an interesting story, certainly. At 2 a.m., it was about 2 a.m., they stormed the Casa prison, which was, as you said, right behind the Hyatt Hotel where the command post was. And what the rioters wanted to do was to free the political prisoners of the Shah and his secret police. But among those Iranian prisoners were 2 Americans who were employees of Ross Perot's Electronic Data Systems Corporation, and they were being held for $13 million in ransom. And Perot was not going to pay that ransom. He sent a team in to rescue these guys, but they laid low until the situation overtook itself, the revolutionary situation, and the storming of the prison was just their opportunity. So,
hold on one second, Charlie. Hold on one second. Linda, jump in here. I think you had a little something to add to that.
Yeah. So there's kind of a backstory here that a lot of people don't know before the meeting at the Hyatt, and Charlie's going to tell you a little more about that. But basically, EDS with Ross Perot, this was their first international contract, so they were not experienced in dealing with foreign governments. And as we all know from flying, the rules that we have in the States don't always apply when you're wandering around the world, and you do have to be careful. And anyhow, there ended up being a major disagreement between Iran and EDS on the system that they were supposed to be developing, and the fact that it didn't, or what they said did not work. And Iran wanted redress for the payments they'd already made, and they weren't going to pay any more. And Perot wanted their money, and it just kind of boiled over into this thing. And finally, the Iranian authorities arrested these 2 EDS representatives and threw them in jail. And keep in mind that all of this took place while the Shah was still in power. So that part of it didn't have anything to do with the revolution, except that those 2 guys were still in jail. Well, so after all those negotiations failed, Perot took matters into his own hands, and he sent a team to Iran to get the guys out. So one day, a couple of guys showed up in Joe's office and wanted to know if they could, if Joe could get if they could get those guys out of the prison, could Joe get them on a Pan Am airplane? And by the way, Joe, we're going to give you 6 figures to do it. And Joe said, well, you know what? I could get them on the airplane, but that's not going to happen, because not only would it be a major diplomatic incident and endanger other Americans who happen to be in country, it would also put the airline in terrible jeopardy. And that just is not something that I'm going to participate in. And so they went on their way. And the guys were eventually, the team broke them, or they got out of the prison, and they ended up at the Hyatt. And Charlie's going to tell you a little bit about that story. But in the end, it all worked out, because those 2 men would probably still be in jail if they hadn't been broken out. But honestly, Joe never forgave Perot for just ignoring the big picture and the repercussions that could take place, and for almost getting that entire Pan Am team killed. And that he never forgave him. So Charlie's going to tell you the rest of that story.
Yeah.
Thank you. Wow, Linda, that's amazing. So back to the thing. So the prison is, that's going on, and what's happening at the Hyatt?
Yeah, well, as Linda said, there were repercussions. So what happened at the Hyatt? Well, let me pick up a little back. So these two prisoners were then, Perot's people got there and got them out of the country overland,
Right.
up to the north and up through Turkey. But rumor was it that they were hiding out at the Hyatt Hotel. And that was to send a contingent of these revolutionaries storming into the hotel, the Hyatt Hotel lobby. One of them shot out the window from the inside, and that set off a barrage of gunfire from the outside. For about a half an hour, they were shooting into the hotel. 2 bullets went into the Pan Am command post. One went right past Joe Reynolds, and it it knocked down Don Sims, who was a short guy, and told me he was only about 5'2". Had he been an inch 5'3", he wouldn't be here telling me the story. And the second bullet went right past Rick Rendham. It wasn't long before the revolutionaries stormed into the command post, and they held the Pan Amers at gunpoint, and they said, "We're going to search your rooms. If we find any guns, we're going to shoot you." Of course, they didn't find any guns, but when they went back to their rooms, they found out all their valuables were gone. And Captain Powers, they had determined that they're going to, it's more than enough for them to handle it. They terminated the command post, and they decided to bring all the Americans out of Iran. And Captain Powers is quoted as saying, "I learned that day what was most important in life: your shoes, your coat, and your passport." But in any case, they sent in 2 707s, and they all the Americans, the last employees at the station and the command post left, but Joe Reynolds stayed behind.
I was going to say that was on February 4th. Let's see, just below. They sent in 2 707s to evacuate the remaining Americans on Pan Am staff,
Yes.
as well as the Intercontinental Hotel employees. Then 2 days later, the
Okay.
U.S. Embassy was attacked and the staff was held at gunpoint. And this is what triggered stage 3 of the evacuation, a formal mandatory order to evacuate. And so 10 Pan Am 747s were ordered to get the remaining 7,000 Americans out. Who stayed behind and why?
Right. Well, they asked, Pan Am management asked if one American would stay behind. The full staff now was the Iranians, who we have to give them credit for their dedication. They didn't walk off the job. They didn't strike. They stayed there, but they wanted one American. Joe stayed behind.
And
He
so Joe
volunteered.
Reynolds was the one.
Joe Reynolds stayed behind.
Joe volunteered.
Yes, he volunteered. He stayed behind, and he would stay for another 9 months. He saw, as you had said, Becky, it was on the 14th when they broached the American embassy. Carter declared an official evacuation to get the 7,000 Americans out and chartering 10 Pan Am 747s. So Joe stayed through that evacuation, and then he stayed another 9 months until November 1979, which is the second time the revolutionaries breached the U.S. Embassy and took the 52 hostages for 444 days. Joe then slipped out of the country on one of the foreign air carriers. I don't remember, but he was
Gulf Air.
lucky to get out, right, Linda? Yeah.
Yeah, Gulf Air. He got out 3 days after they took the embassy and carried with him one suitcase. He poured sugar in his gas tank so that they weren't going to get his car, or if they did, it wouldn't go very far. So,
well,
everything behind.
Joe Reynolds was a true Pan Am hero, Linda, and I know you miss him.
Oh, terribly, yes.
We salute his memory today. And Joe and all the others, I mean, it's simply remarkable what these Pan American people did. Stage 3 of the evacuation was summed up in the words of an in-flight director, World Wings member Hans Pigmans, who wrote, "Finally, as the plane's wheels released from the tarmac in Tehran, almost every one of those passengers broke into tears of happiness. All I knew is that the crew, myself included, breathed a sigh of relief as our chests filled with pride for the great service we had provided these fellow citizens of the world. That pretty much says it all, Charlie. Yeah, as you write, in terms of Pan Am's legacy of loyalty, bravery, duty, and responsibility. Thank you so much for this wonderful book. It is a must read for all of you and for your families. And thank you, Charlie, for being here today.
Thank you very much.
Okay, you can buy Charlie's book on Amazon. Missions of Mercy and Evacuation Flights. Terrific, Charlie. Thank you. Our next book is Come Fly the World, the jet age story of the women of Pan Am. And Linda's bringing up a slide of that so you can all see the cover.
She's trying.
Oh, there we go. And it's by Julia Cook. And Julia is a journalist and travel writer whose features and personal essays have been published in Time Magazine, Smithsonian, Condé Nast Traveler, and Saveur Magazine. She is the author of The Other Side of Paradise, Life in the New Cuba, and she is also, I might add, a Pan Am baby. Welcome, Julia. And she's on mute, but we got her almost. Linda's unmuting her right now.
Asked to unmute. There we go.
There we go. Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So good to see you.
It's so good to see you.
Tell us about your Pan Am family connection and how it led to the writing of this book.
Yeah. So my dad was general counsel at Pan Am for a couple of years. He was an attorney with the airline for about 10 years, I think, maybe 12. But honestly, Pan Am had really just been more a part of our family lore than anything else. I grew up hearing stories about when I was 3 years old, for example, and we hopscotched across the Pacific on, I think, 7 or 8 flights, but right before the Pacific routes were sold. My parents I apparently behaved pretty well, so I was pretty lucky. But really, I hadn't thought that much on a journalistic level about the airline until I saw that the Pan Am Historical Foundation was going to be hosting an event at the TWA terminal, which was a commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Beatles landing in the US on Pan Am, of course. So I went to this event and I wound up talking the whole time to 2 women who were in the Manhattan chapter. And they invited me to go to a luncheon. And so I started just kind of crashing some of your parties and luncheons, and I was completely fascinated. The more women I met, the more I thought you were a really remarkable group of people who had, I was most impressed with the degree to which you tended to mix interesting, funny anecdotes about the world and just really profound and knowledgeable geopolitical insights about history and about, experiences that you'd had that I sensed had a lot more gravity than just where to buy the best shoes, although I appreciated that information also.
Although that was fun too.
Yeah, totally. I mean, both of these things can exist at the same time. Exactly. So that was what I found really remarkable.
Well, the Pan Am story is a really big one, as we know. It spans almost 70 years, and you've chosen to write about the stewardesses who were flying in the late 60s to the mid 70s. How did you decide on that particular time frame? I mean, did you do it for nostalgic reasons or what?
So I was really interested in the convergence of cultural changes in the US and the ways in which stewardesses were both impacted by the change and propelling that change too. If you think about it, 66 to 75, it was the time of the Vietnam War and its protest movements. It was the time of the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and the ERA, and a ton of lawsuits that were pushing women into places and positions that they hadn't been in before. So it was a time of really changing perspectives on the role of government, the role of business, and the role of women amid all of that. So to my eye, stewardesses were really a unique and, really special part of all of that change. And I wanted to document that.
Yes, it was a very tranquil time for those.
Yeah, I know. So I've heard.
Well, I'd like to mention the names of the women you've profiled because some of them may be watching today or may know them. Lynn Totten Rawling, Tori Werner, Claire Christensen, Hazel Bowie, and Karen Ryan. You did a lot of traveling to interview them, didn't you?
I did. So at first I was doing more travel just to figure out what story I wanted to tell, what aspect of it I wanted to talk about, and who I wanted to spend, a lot of time interviewing. So I was just at first I went to the Bangkok conference, I went to Savannah, I went to a bunch of luncheons in Manhattan, and then I wound up traveling to actually interview and spend time with the women that I was, that I decided would be the central figures of the book. I went to Montana to visit Karen, and I saw Tori in Southern California and the Bahamas, where Lynn lives. And they were all just so remarkably generous, both with their time and their homes and their families.
As you came to all of these reunions and conventions and things, as you got to know us, what characteristics did you find that we all have in common?
Curiosity, spontaneity, extroversion. It was a real unique, I think it's a really unique set of personality traits. I think that, you were all both hired to be analytical and able to think on your feet and really brave, as Charlie's talk really points to, but you were also really diplomatic and people pleasers and savvy and very psychologically astute, able to assess what people, real human beings might need in a moment of stress or, fear and true danger.
You assert that a stewardess career was a contradiction in the sense that, here we are, we're getting put on the scales and we're getting written up if our hair and makeup weren't just right. All the while roaming about the world on our own or with another stewardess pal. The more far-flung and remote it was, the better we liked it. Of course, you stated it much better than I just did. Here's what you write. I just wanted to give you this quote. Flight routes, experience, and expertise varied by airline, but having a job on any plane was a reason for a woman to roam. What was revolutionary was the lack of should in this job, the plenitude of could. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, one of the, that contradiction that you mentioned is really what propelled me into this story. I was really, this is not news to any of you, obviously. I was commenting to a friend of mine how strange it would be to talk to you as an audience, because for the most part, I'm explaining this contradiction to people who really don't understand it. It's a little weird for me to be telling you all about your experiences, so please bear with me. But what struck me as an outsider and as a younger woman was that, there were so many constraints. Hiring practices were really, really quite sexist. I can't tell you how excruciating it was to read some of the assessments of physical attributes in, the hiring notes in the archives. It was really some breathtaking objectification. And yet there was access to so many places in a workplace where, in action, women were in charge of the cabin, where you were hired for your femininity. You were not hired in spite of being women. As was the case as women in the women's movement were, pushing their ways into law schools and medical schools and into places where women really had not been welcome. So there was a real, sense of, this is, again, not news to you, a sense of real sisterhood there and empowerment. And, you were able to you were collecting company money to go explore places. And this was merely 20 years after it was completely unacceptable for women to be traveling alone or without a chaperone. So it was really revolutionary.
Well, your reviewers definitely agreed with this conversation. One of them writes that your book brings vividly to life a contradictory profession, one that, for all its limitations, offered untold numbers of women a chance for true liberation.
I'm really grateful that a number of the reviewers have really seemed to get it. I think that, one of the reasons that I wanted to write the book was that I felt like you women were kind of the missing link between this era in which women were not allowed to travel, or in which it was not socially acceptable for a woman to travel on her own in the 40s and earlier. And then me, I grew up traveling a lot. I was 17 and in Mexico by myself. So there seems to be a real, in my mind, you guys were the link between those two experiences and the divergence therein.
Now, let's talk about careers. In terms of wanting to get promoted and do other things. After jumping through some pretty serious hiring hoops, which we've just discussed, how did, oh, wait, that was the next question, I think. Okay, sorry about that. How did having access to the entire world change the stewardesses' lives? I mean,
yeah, this was one of the things that I was most interested in. I was interested in socio-political change, but also the intimate change, the kind of the ways that individual people's lives reflect those really big currents that, are really well documented. Tons has been written about the 60s and the early 70s. And I was really more interested in the smallness of one person's life, which is really huge, not small at all. So, to my eye, a lot of the change was what we would today call, in the parlance of probably some psychotherapy, but self-actualization. I think about how much I've learned about myself by traveling.
Self-actualization at 30,000 feet.
Exactly. No, truly. I mean, when I reflect on my life, I'm so grateful to have grown up in an airline family and to have grown up with the privilege of being able to travel a lot and to kind of see who I am in different places and to test my own reactions and to, hone my values and figure out what I want out of life. I think travel is the best possible way to do that. And it also hones a sense of empathy and the ability to get along with different kinds of people, to meet different kinds of people. So, that was one of the things that I really noticed, the commonality in a lot of the women that I interviewed, was this sense of, as I mentioned before, this overwhelming curiosity and openness to new experience. I think that was one of the most incredible, and really, I was inspired by it. I hope to maintain that trait throughout my whole life, the way that so many of you have.
I don't think there's one of us that would say that this job wasn't life-changing, for us.
Absolutely.
So now we'll get to the career question, which I jumped to. They did face misogyny and discrimination in their career paths. Now, give us a quick example of that and some of the legal challenges that were taken up by the stewardesses to remedy the situation.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I found really interesting when I was doing research, there's a really interesting book called Femininity in Flight, which is all about it's an academic book. So it's a little drier, but it's about the labor movement as pertains stewardesses. And I was really interested to learn that in the early 60s, well, okay, so back up. Obviously, you all know that in the 60s, there were requirements that you quit upon marriage or when you turn 35. Now, I've heard that Pan Am did not actually, push people out the way that other airlines did, but those rules were on the books, and that means a lack of job security for a 37-year-old woman who wants to keep working. As well, she should be able to keep working. So at first, in the early 60s, women across all airlines really tried to do they tried to take the sugar. You what is it? What's the saying, Becky? You attract more flies. You catch more flies with sugar.
With honey.
With honey. Yes. So they tried to be really nice about it and kind of point out the logic, the logical fallacy that a woman in her mid 30s, couldn't perform the job and couldn't also look good while performing it. So they held press conferences and they challenged. They put like 5 women in a row in front of the press and challenged the press, the all male press, obviously, to pick out which of the women was over 35. And one of them even wore a sign that said, "Do I look like an old bag?" So, you know, they were really trying to convince the powers that be, which were, again, all male, corporate, you know, the heads of corporations. They were really trying to get them to drop these regulations on their own and not have to escalate it to lawsuits. But that, of course, did not work. So, you know, a couple of really intrepid, shocker. So a couple of women brought lawsuits against various airlines. And at first in the 60s, the judges decided in favor of the airlines that you know, who really mounted an incredible defense. Again, excruciating to read about the ways in which they called psychiatrists onto the stand to try to convince the judge and jury that only a woman could perform the job well, and only an unmarried woman at that. And they actually said that, my favorite argument was that married women's husbands kept calling and they didn't have enough switchboard operators. They would have to hire, it was too much of a burden for them to hire more switchboard operators to field all of the calls from all of the husbands who would call and ask where their wives were. So that was the most creative defense that I read about. But eventually those rules dropped. And again, this is one of the things that I found fascinating. You know, there's a pretty good documentation in the feminist literature of these labor law battles because stewardesses set the legal precedent that wound up changing, you know, equal employment, gender-based equal employment discrimination laws forever. So again, there's a fair amount that has been written about that. And there are a couple of books that I think I have links to them on my website if anyone's interested in reading about them. But what fascinated me, I wanted to know, if women were fighting this hard for this job, then the job itself and what it offered them must have been remarkable. So I wanted to know exactly how and why.
Great. Tell us what you learned about racism in the airline industry in America at large in the 60s.
Yeah, again, excruciating. People were, you know, and the airline, the corporations were incredibly openly racist in the 50s in particular and early 60s. It was really, you know, tough in moments to read the things that they really openly said. Again, lawsuits proved the solution. Black women with the NAACP behind them brought lawsuits against various airlines. And by 1962, the first woman of color was hired on Northwest Airlines. And then pretty soon thereafter, a couple of women were hired on a couple of different airlines. Still, there were very, very few who were actually hired. It wouldn't be until after the EEOC's passage in 1964 and implementation a few years later that a really larger number of women of color were hired. Even so, on a lot of different airlines, Pan Am included, numbers remained really low for a couple of different reasons. You know, one of the things that I really learned in researching this book, you know, I wanted to paint an intersectional portrait of the women on Pan Am because you were a pretty diverse group, and that diversity was happening in the late 60s and early 70s. So that was a big part of the story that I wanted to tell. But I remain completely convinced that someone needs to write a book about the racial integration of Pan Am in particular. I really hope, I think I've heard that the group of women who call themselves the Blackbirds are doing a documentary, I think. And I really hope that gets off the ground because I certainly would be very excited to see it.
And if they do, we'll talk to them about it.
Yeah.
You're on Jet Reads. We've just spoken with Charlie about the willingness of Pan Am's flight crews to volunteer for evacuation flights and missions of mercy. Now that characteristic shows up in your book too, when you discuss the R&R flights in and out of Vietnam. Tell us briefly about the charters and what it was like for the stewardesses flying them who had differing views on the war.
Hugely differing views on the war. You know, a lot of the women that I talked to were quite, you know, pro-Vietnam. Others were vehemently against what they saw as an unjust war in a sovereign nation. But they were united, completely united in a sense of duty towards the soldiers that they flew on war charters themselves, and, you know, towards the mission on missions of mercy in particular. They felt a really keen sense of responsibility and duty to do what they were called upon to do, to treat soldiers in particular with a real sense of empathy. They were aware that the draft was on, that not all of these men wanted to be going into war themselves, that they might be the last Western women that some of these men might see. And they felt really a sense of really keen duty.
Now, perhaps no other mission of mercy tugs at the heartstrings more than Operation Baby Lift. As far as I know, there are no other accounts of the actual onboard experience that are as complete as yours, because you've assembled so many eyewitnesses. What did you learn that you didn't know before about it, and how are your readers reacting to learning about those flights?
So I had not known anything about it. So absolutely everything that I learned about that flight was new to me. One of the things, you're completely right. No one, I read a lot of books that talked about Operation Baby Lift itself as an event, or about its political ramifications, or, and any number of different, I read about it in David Butler's book, The Fall of Saigon, which is an incredible work of reportage. But you're right, no one really focused on the in-flight experience, the experience of the women who were crewing these flights. I talked to 6 people who were there, 5 of the crew members and 1 person on the ground. And I also, read a bunch of different books, and I looked at photos, and I read the news. And, it was interesting. So often, I think, women's stories don't get put on the record, because it's like what in informal diplomacy in statecraft is called the protocol officers, which basically means that, if nothing goes drastically wrong, you've done your job really well. Everything should be seamless. And I think that, flight crew in particular, stewardesses, as long as everyone got safely from one destination to the other and they had a good experience, you were doing your job. And that was always sometimes really, really difficult under extreme duress to perform that.
Well, this would be the ultimate 500 babies.
Absolutely.
That were, not only that, they were sick. I mean,
it was incredible.
Milk, and yeah, so one can only imagine. And let's remind everybody that they volunteered, did they not?
Absolutely. Yeah. It was really that impulse to me, that moment. It gives me chills to even still think about it. The fact of, being in Hong Kong, told that you're going to be asked to / told that your flight was going to be going to Saigon, where the first Operation Baby Lift flight had just crashed, and no one knew why. And all of these women said yes, which I think is an incredible
enemy fire for all they knew.
It's an incredible impulse.
Oh, well, simply amazing. Well, I, for one, am so grateful to you for writing this book, because finally, we now have a substantive book about our profession that includes the facts and the figures, but not too many, of how we reshaped the conversation around a woman's value and place at home and in the world, as you say in your study guide. In the promotional events that you've done so far, Julia, do you sense from your audiences that their perception of stewardesses has been changed by this book?
Some of them, yes. And I also sense, though, that a lot of the readers are people who knew this was the case, but who feel like validated or vindicated. Yeah. And who are excited that someone else is putting it on the record. It was one of the things. I got an email from a professor at Michigan State last week who told me that he was going to be, he come across the book via a friend of a friend, and he was excited about it and had enjoyed it, and was going to talk to the labor, the department that at Michigan State that focuses on labor studies. And I was that thrills me. That makes me so excited to think that your stories are going to be might be on syllabi somewhere, and really entering the historical record for the importance of what actually took place.
Resuming our rightful place in history, Julia.
It's really important. It's truly important. If not, we just keep reinventing the wheel. We keep asking women to do the same thing over and over again.
Right. Well, has anything else come as a surprise to you about all this?
So I have 2 answers to that question. One is, I got a piece of advice from someone now that I have 115 people who are all involved in World Wings right here, captive audience. I got a piece of advice that did surprise me at the Savannah convention from a woman who I don't know her name. She was so beautiful, and she was wearing a silver lame dress. I think she was Danish, but I'm not sure. I had asked her, I was impressed by her beauty and her elegance, and I asked her if she had any advice for aging gracefully, and she gave me advice that did surprise me. She told me to let my hair go gray and to invest all the money that I would have spent on hair dyeing, on staying fit. And I have shared that advice far and wide. And if any of you know who wore a floor-length silver lame dress to the Savannah Convention gala dinner, please email me and tell me who that woman is so that I can thank her.
Well, if anybody,
I know that's not at all what your question was meant to get me to say, but I needed to throw it in there.
To go gray, whether we wanted to or not during the last year. So I think I'm glad to know that it's good advice. Well, and finally, Julie, I see you've dedicated the book to your father, thanking him for all the window seats he saved for you when the family traveled on Pan Am when you were a child. Can you comment on that real quick?
My dad does not remember saving me the window seats, and yet I remember only ever sitting in the window seats. So who knows who's right and who's wrong in that. I love the window seat. There's no place that I'm happier in the world. It's my favorite place to be. So, you know.
Well, something tells me that you may not only have a window seat when you fly in the future, but you may be sitting in 1A in first class. All of our viewers know exactly what that means. Congratulations on the book, Julia. We're very, very proud of you, and we wish you continued success. The book, everybody, is Come Fly the World, the Jet Age Story of the Women of Pan Am, and it's available on Amazon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great to see you, Julia.
Good to see you too.
We know you've got another interview coming up and you might have to scoot, so thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
Okay, our next book is Pan Am's First Lady, The Diary of Betty Stettinius Trippe. And let me pull up my little script here. This is a fascinating account of what it was like to be along for the ride as Juan Trippe was getting Pan Am off the ground all the way through until his retirement. And her youngest child, Ed Trippe, is here to talk to us about it. He needs no introduction, although I should say he's the president of the Pan Am Historical Foundation. And Ed, thank you so much for being here. And I think Linda is going to unmute you and we'll get you going. There we go.
Am I unmuted?
You're good to go. Thank you for being here.
It's great to be with you.
Ed, tell us how this second edition of your mother's book came about.
Well, it was the second edition. The first one was something my mother did. She just compiled it of all of our old diaries and letters, and it was pretty private, and she published it really just before she died. 12 years later, Pan Am had gone, and you know, we were looking for a project to use to help promote the legacy of the company. And Kathleen Clare was Dad's assistant. One of us sort of said, well, let's reproduce my mother's letters, and we went to the curator of the Smithsonian, who had a publishing business on the side, and he was very enthusiastic about the idea, and that's where it started. But we really just saw it as a great legacy, not just to Pan Am, but to my mother and my father.
And the proceeds of the book, Ed?
The proceeds, it was a Pan Am Historical Foundation project. They underwrote it, and it's their book, and all the proceeds go to continuing to promote the legacy of the company.
The book begins with Betty and Juan meeting and their courtship. And to our viewers, if you all don't know that story, you'll love it. You'll have to read the book to get it. But today, let's pick up their story in late 1929 as the first mail flights to South America were taking place. To set the stage, Betty and Juan had married in June of the previous year. That would be 1928. And Juan was already charting Pan Am's expansion. So they're on their way to the Caribbean and South America with none other than Charles and Ann Lindbergh. Tell us about that trip and why Mr. and Mrs. Lindbergh were along.
You know, on one level, it was a story about early aviation and business development, in the 30s, late in the 20s, in Central and South America, but it was just the beginning of Pan Am's growth. But beyond that, it's really a story that is very personal. And it's about two, you got to think about them. They were two very young couples on an awesome trip of international diplomacy. That was really what Lindbergh was all about at that point. Business development, which was Dad's bent. But beyond that, it was a really youthful fun. The four young couples off on an amazing adventure.
Well, we should all remember that in 1929, your mother, Betty, and Ann Lindbergh were both 25 years old. Charles Lindbergh was 29 and your dad was 30. Now, I want our viewers just to think about that for a second and think back on what you were all like at that age. So here we have these four young people, occasionally, if not infrequently, showing their fun-loving immaturity. It really is what makes them human in the book. It also cements their friendship for the rest of their lives. Can you give us some examples of this that your mother recounts in the book?
Mom would she loved to recount the antics, and just their youth really just underscored that. But Lindbergh, of course, was the celebrity. The crowds and the dignitaries, everybody wanted to see him, everybody wanted to honor him. But Lindbergh also, we know, was very shy. He really hated the spotlight. He hated being typecast as the hero that he was. And he thought right along that Dad was the president of Pan Am, and in this trip that they were taking, that Dad should be equally honored, if not honored, really more so. So in each country they visited, and they visited quite a few along that trip, in the receptions and the government meetings and out in front of all the crowds, everybody wanted Lindbergh. And Lindbergh didn't want to be out in front. So he solved the problem by finding one of Ann Lindbergh's hat pins. And he used to come up behind Dad and give him a big, pin in his butt, pushing him out in front. And of course, Dad retaliated. He knew that Lindbergh really, the crowds wanted him, the government wanted him. So he got his own hat pin. And so then on, this pin fight between the two of them went on and on, city after city, that pins would come out. It was hilarious.
I'm imagining two of the most famous men in the 20th century doing this, having a pin fight. It's too much. There's also the story of an emergency landing in Barranquilla, and Betty's description was mesmerizing and reflected their sense of adventure and the immortality of youth. Would you like to read us the quote that describes what happened and then talk to us about it?
It had to have been harrowing, yeah, but she, and again, you think about their youth, but she said, I'll read it from we reached Barranquilla in the late afternoon. The crowds were swarming over the field, pushing for a place to see Lindbergh. It became impossible for the police to control the crowd. Lindbergh repeatedly dropped notes asking the field to be cleared. He was saying we were running out of gas. And they went around. And then suddenly, both engines stopped. And there wasn't a sound in the cockpit until Charles said, "It's all right. I've had my eye on a lagoon in the interior outside of Barranquilla." And then Mom continues in her diary, "We were all unnaturally quiet, but we didn't have time to be frightened. It happened so quickly. We silently glided down and landed in the lagoon. And once landed, they all just laughed in relief." It's really showed their immortality of the youth again.
And they must have been incredibly scared in retrospect. I mean, landing in the jungle, and they had who came to get them when they landed in the lagoon?
Well, they were out in the middle of this lagoon outside of the city, away from the airport, and suddenly these big dugout canoes arrive around the plane, and Indians scantily clad in only G-strings, and they come, and that's their ticket out. So they all get out of the plane, get into the canoes, and paddle ashore. Luggage, I guess, somehow followed them, but that's how they got out of the jungle.
All in a day's work. Now, these youthful antics continued, didn't they?
They continue really throughout the trip, but a few days after Barranquilla, they were in Nicaragua, and the two of them were put in a house. They were put up in all sorts of places, houses, embassies, guest houses. But this night they had their own house. But as happened every place they went, the Lindberghs were shown the grand suite, and Mom and Dad were shown the smaller suite. Well, they got into this house, and the Lindberghs immediately went to the small bedroom and left the big bedroom suite to my parents, and they weren't going to have anything. They weren't going to have that on. So it ended up in a pillow fight, which turned into a water fight, all over who should have the smaller bedrooms. And these antics went on every night, but not the pillow fight and the water fight. That was just this one place. But Lindbergh in the end solved the problem of the bedroom by beginning to undress. And my parents fled. So the Lindberghs won that particular battle. But then there were other events. When they finally got to Paramaribo, the mail was delivered, and they had a very formal dinner. And I think they were exhausted at that point. But the formal dinner, and Lindbergh sitting next to some woman who spoke very poor, if no English. He finally just gave up trying to communicate or entertain her, but he was sitting across the street, across the table from my mother, and he began to wiggle his ears and make faces at her. I've actually, years and years later, he'd come to East Hampton's visit, and he'd sit at the dining room table and start wiggling his ears, and he was hilarious. But this evening, in this formal dinner, my mother is sitting here watching him making an absolute clown of himself, wiggling his ears at her. But that was the nature of this close friendship of these young kids flying around the Caribbean. But there are other times, that he would be, I don't know whether it was which city it was, but they landed and the field was wet. Lindbergh's feet got wet, and his socks were wet. He took his socks off that afternoon, flying out, hung them out in the plane, and they flew away. So he arrived at the next destination, the next reception, and he had no socks on. So he went there with the dignitaries with his bare feet in his shoes.
That now I think we could see the beginnings of the crew culture of Pan Am taking shape, this vibrant, humorous crew culture that we also know and love. It started early and from the get-go. The recently released documentary, Across the Pacific, made me want to reread your mother's 1936 account of the inaugural passenger flight of the Philippine Clipper from San Francisco to Hong Kong. The flight was amazing in itself, but then your parents continued on around the world. It took them 53 days to circle the globe, 38 days of it flying. Now that is quite a trip. I just want to say to our viewers that you don't want to miss her account of this journey. It includes absolutely wonderful things like Juan Trippe's meeting with a then Major Eisenhower in Manila, doesn't it, Ed?
Yeah. Ike was General MacArthur's chief of staff, and MacArthur, of course, at the time was the Philippines were a protectorate of the United States, so he was really he was in charge, and Ike was his number two, and he developed. He wasn't there when this Pan Am flight came through, so Dad got to know Ike, and it was the beginning of a very long, close relationship that spanned all the way through to the White House, and they were really quite close friends.
Oh, it sounds like a wonderful story, but our viewers are going to have to read the book to get the rest of the details. But let's pick up the trip when they left Asia and the Middle East. They've had a hectic week of meetings and events in Europe, and then they change plans and they decide to take the Hindenburg home via Rio rather than go by ship back to New York. So they go to Berlin and to Frankfurt, which is where they were going to board the dirigible. What were their impressions of pre-war Germany?
They had arrived in Europe and been in London and had met with Lindbergh, who was even at that point very aware of what was going on in Germany and the militarism. So he was advising them. So when they arrived in Germany, I think they were equally as impressed by the gathering militarism of Germany. In particular, the technology. The Dad was sort of struck by the very frank discussions that he was listening to. He was feted by the Lufthansa board. He was frankly he was taken back at the discussions about war, their preparations for war, but in particular, he was concerned about the emphasis on military aviation. And that was 1936. So he could see that they were so far ahead in terms of planning and avionics, so far ahead of Europe, and the United States was catching up, but way behind.
And your mother writes that at a lot of these dinners and functions that they had to attend, if she tried to ask about things that were going on, the subject would immediately get changed, right?
Well, she was put down. I mean, it was maybe sort of go back to Julia's points. The ladies didn't have the position at that point to make political comments. So she was clearly told or asked about whether she liked swimming or liked to arrange flowers, and she was extremely frustrated because she was reading all this all that was going on in Germany and was intently interested, but she wasn't getting answers.
They even had a letter from Hermann Goering in their hotel room, didn't they, when they came back from the...
Indeed they did. It was sort of alarming.
Extolling the virtues of National Socialism. That would have given me that was a very spooky thing to read.
Exactly.
But why did they want to travel on the Hindenburg?
I think Dad was curious. He was, the Clippers were way ahead of any other airplane in terms of ability to span oceans and travel long distances. The DC-2 and DC-3 were coming along, and they were great advances in terms of the land planes, but the seaplanes were well advanced of anything that was being produced in Europe. But but the blimps were a different type of experience. You know, they were slow, they were susceptible to bad weather, but they afforded a level of luxury that I think he was just curious as what the experience was like. So they decided to take it on the last leg home on the way from Europe to Rio. Went to Frankfurt, and before boarding, they had breakfast with a man named Heinz Ronsky, he ran the Zeppelin operation, but they'd known him in New York as a much younger man, very ambitious at the time, and I think they quite liked him. But the morning before boarding the Hindenburg, they had breakfast with him, and they were struck about how overbearing he had become, how conceited, and really to the point of being rude, talking about the disadvantages of airplanes and even the Clippers as compared to the experience of flying in the Zeppelin. So he was. They were curious to what was it going to be like, but in any case, so they boarded it in Frankfurt. It was an amazing trip, but I think the thing that was impressed them the most was the luxury of it. It was the size of the lounges. They were 40 feet in the living room lounge, and then the dining room was equally big, and below the lounge was a smoking bar. It's amazing to think they were smoking on with all that hydrogen filled around them, but they even had that.
I know. I read that and I thought, how did they secure that room?
Yeah.
We're going to smoke in there.
That little smoking room, it struck me as the same size and shape as the lounge on the Strata Cruiser, and people go down there and go down there and smoke. And I remember as a little boy going down there just being awestruck by the smoking room in the Strata Cruiser. Well, the Hindenburg it had the same experience. But I think, going back to their experience with the Hindenburg, what I think struck them most was the level of service, the level of food service, and the fine wines, and the 4-course meals. I think Pan Am was way ahead of most airlines in terms of food service, but in 1936 and not until much later, they didn't serve liquor. Mom writes in her memoirs, 3 years later, on the inaugural flight to Lisbon on the B314, that there was no liquor served, and she wrote that Pan Am didn't serve liquor out of concern that an intoxicated passenger might interfere with the flight crew. And I guess we've seen that happen over the years. Mm-hmm. But that was a policy that came. I bet it came out of Andre Priester, because he was a stickler for that type of thing. But Pan Am didn't serve, although curiously on the return trip from that inaugural flight to Lisbon, and Dad was on board that one, and they boarded in Marseille and went to Lisbon, and the mom writes about the flight out of Lisbon and the very elaborate, wonderful meal they had with very festive, she says, with Portuguese sardines, hors d'oeuvres, French cheese, and champagne. And I think that may have been one of the first flights that Pan Am served liquor. Although she did write that they were, on an earlier flight that she'd been invited into somebody's stateroom on a B314, and they got out their own liquor supply that they brought in their suitcase. So liquor was on board, but not served by Pan Am.
One way or another, it was there.
Sometime in the 30s, late 30s.
So it could be argued that this trip on the Hindenburg could have inspired the later elegant service that we had on board the Clippers, right?
I think it probably did. I mean, the other European carriers, though, were offering wine and liquor on their service in Latin America and South America. So Pan Am had to feel the competition, but the impressions that, Dad came away with on that Hindenburg flight were clearly, if you could do it, and when he talks about, later on the inaugural flight to Europe and being feted at Maxine's, well, that all happened later, not much later.
Yeah. Well, the Hindenburg, of course, it may have been superb, but we know the Boeing 314s weren't far behind. And at that point, the Zeppelin's days were limited, weren't they?
Excuse me, they were.
The Zeppelin's days were limited.
The Zeppelin was, you think of less than, I think it was only 6 months later, and the Hindenburg would blow up, and as it was landing in Lindenhurst, New Jersey, and that was the end of the Zeppelins.
That was that. And something that comes through to me about your parents' travels were these incredibly long hours they kept. And not just on the 1936 Pacific round the world trip, but many other trips to South America and Europe. The demands on their time were just mind-boggling. I mean, they attended endless diplomatic receptions and business meetings for your dad and dinner dances, all followed by these middle of the night wake ups for the next legs of their flights. I mean, even for young people in their 30s, it had to be incredibly stressful. How did they do it?
I have no idea how they did it, because they were, they were very good, obviously, at catching a nap whenever they could, and the flights were long in those days, so they had the time on board to catch up, and if they had 3 hours of sleep and a good hotel bed, they had 8 hours sleep later on some flight across whatever ocean. But those flights were really stressful, and those trips they took, one business meeting, one social function, one state dinner after another, so it just went on and on.
Yeah. Well, in the time that we have left, tell us what else, is there anything else about your mother's book that stands out?
One of the most significant improvements, changes from the first edition, are the photographs. My mother was a wonderful photographer in her own right, but the photography and the photographs in her book they really, I can go pick it up and just thumb through. I know the stories in the book, but I thumb through and look at the pictures, and I'm just mesmerized by them. They really are a wonderful, nostalgic history of that era, and they add tremendously to her memoirs.
In terms of their personalities, you've often said that your parents made a great team for building the world's most experienced airline. Can you comment on that?
They certainly complemented one another. There's no question. Dad was a big picture guy, always thinking years ahead of today. Maybe on occasion or often losing sight of the here and now. And yes, he was always late for many things. My mother was granular. She was always dealing in the present, whether it's for family matters and things going on at home, or matters involving Pan Am. She was constantly sort of keeping the here and now and focused. And Dad was notoriously bad at remembering names, and my mother she had a photographic memory for names, so they were a great partnership, and
they were perfectly matched.
Without question, Pan Am's first lady.
Indeed she was. Indeed she was. What an amazing life they led. Thank you so much, Ed. The book is Pan Am's First Lady, The Diary of Betty Stettinius Trippe. And Linda's going to be showing you a copy and where to buy that. The slide is coming up. This one is not available on Amazon, but it is available on the Pan Am Historic Foundation website at panam.org. You're going to love it for the pictures alone, but it's fun to read about where she shopped and what she thought of various world leaders and her amazing volunteerism during the war. Well, it makes me miss her, Ed, and I wish that she could be with us today.
Well, just look at that front cover there, the picture of my mother and father and Charles and Ann Lindbergh setting off on that amazing trip. And that really captures a lot of what that book is all about.
Just incredible. Just incredible. Thanks so much, Ed. We really appreciate your being here today.
Great to be with you.
Back to you, Nancy.
Unmute. Okay.
Here you are.
Are we there? Okay. Wow. Did everyone enjoy that as much as I did? That was fantastic. And thank you so much, Becky, Ed, Julia, and Charlie, for all the hard work you've done and the dedication to present such a wonderful program to our membership. We can't thank you enough. And thank you, Linda, for all the technical glitches you've been dealing with during this meeting and your expertise in smoothing them out. Want more? Well, future Jet Reads will be scheduled soon. The focus will always be on our history presented in a respectable fashion through works of scholarly pursuits, explorations of various aspects of Pan Am's groundbreaking history, accounts of our flying days, historical fiction novels, and other reputable literary representations. In fact, we have two authors that will feature in the future. One is John Hill. There he is. John, do you want to hold up your book? John has written Pan Am at War, and we'll be featuring him at some point in the future. And then I see Camille DeMaio, who is the recipient of our World Wings study grant for the Richter Library. And Camille is a historical fiction novelist, and she is in the process of writing a book called Come Fly With Me, which includes all kinds of stories that we have given her and shared with her. A few other books that we have coming up, and this is not limited to, would be Hunting the Wind, Food and Aviation in the 20th Century. And if we can get copies of this book in the United States, we'd like to try to do Pan Am in Norway too. So if you haven't done so already, the books highlighted here today are available at Amazon or through the Pan Am Historical Foundation. We thank each of you for flying with us on this truly remarkable flight and look forward to welcome you aboard our next Jet Reads flight. Until then, treat yourselves to reading the books featured this afternoon or this morning, whatever your time zone may be. We have 12 time zones, by the way. So be well, and thanks to all involved. Have a great day.